9 years since the DPRK was first removed from the U.S. list naming sponsors of terror, President Trump this week once again put the DPRK back on that list along with Iran, Syria and Sudan. Trump also said that he would trigger very large additional sanctions to put maximum pressure on the DPRK. Meanwhile, 3 U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups are now gathering in the waters nearby. With sabers rattling and tension increasing, what will happen next between the two main actors? And what can other countries do to help avert a conflict and remove nuclear weapons from Korea? To look at the crisis in the larger picture, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Gregory Kulaki, Senior Analyst and China Project Manager of the Union of Concerned Scientists. We shall also speak to Pavel Falkenhor, Russian Defense Analyst, via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Before we start, let's take a look at this.
Tuesday afternoon, the U.S. Treasury Department issued sanctions against 34 additional individuals and companies. The latest round of sanctions falls under 3 categories. 4 Chinese companies who allegedly exported raw materials and computers to Pyongyang, and 1 Chinese individual, Mr. Sidong Sun, who reportedly owns one of the designated companies. DPRK entities include 9 companies and 20 ships. According to photographs released by Washington, these companies allegedly used ship-to-ship transfers to move products in an effort to evade sanctions, and that is also a violation of September's UN Security Council resolution, which passed unanimously. 1 DPRK company also named on allegations it exported DPRK workers to generate revenue for Pyongyang, and this too violates that same UN resolution. Now, none of these sanctions are connected to Monday's White House announcement that Washington is adding Pyongyang back to its state sponsor of terrorism list. That decision is raising some concerns in Beijing, though, where there's fear that any further pressure on Pyongyang could lead to the resumption of its unlawful missile tests. China Daily's English paper issuing this editorial on Tuesday, quote, "The U.S. designation of the DPRK as a state sponsor of terrorism could lay waste to the efforts of China and Russia to bring the DPRK back to the negotiating table."
We still hope that all parties concerned will put forth more efforts, which will be conducive to alleviating tensions and bringing relevant parties back to the negotiating table, back to the right track of dialogue and negotiation.
And at the same time, airline Air China is reportedly suspending flights between Beijing and the DPRK. An airline press officer was quoted by the Associated Press saying the flights were, quote, temporarily suspended due to unsatisfactory business operations. There is no mention of the change on the airline's English website. President Moon Jae-in will visit China next month. Late last month, you may remember, the two countries resumed normal relations after Beijing objected to Seoul's decision to install an American anti-missile defense system known as THAAD.
That's a very comprehensive and deep depiction of what's going on concerning the process of denuclearization, particularly the mounting tensions between Pyongyang and Washington. My first question is, what do you think of, say, the mission of Mr. Song Tao, the special envoy of President Xi Jinping, who went to Pyongyang and met with 2 senior North Korean government officials? So far, no details of the mission have been released by the Chinese authorities, except for a very brief news bulletin by Pyongyang about the mission. With a smile on his face, do you think Mr. Song Tao came back empty-handed, or do you think there should be some deliverables?
Well, it's impossible to know. But I can say that in the United States, the visit was covered by the U.S. media and discussed by a lot of U.S. experts, and I think there's hope in some parts of the United States that he did come back with something to share for the rest of us.
You have been pretty pessimistic about what China can do. What resources China could possibly leverage in persuading the DPRK and bring the regime back to the negotiating table in what is called the 6-party talks?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the United States, in the arms control community where I work, I think the consensus is that there's very little that either China or the United States has to offer North Korea at this point, and that the chance of them abandoning or giving up their nuclear weapons program is extremely small.
Do you suggest the futile attempt by Beijing and Washington would mean we have to end up accepting the DPRK as one of the nuclear-armed countries in the world?
There's a difference between recognizing that North Korea feels it needs nuclear weapons and recognizing it as a nuclear weapon state. I don't think we need to accept or recognize its status as a nuclear weapon state, but at the same time I think we all need to realize that it's highly unlikely, after so many years of effort and so much difficulty to procure nuclear weapons, that the North Korean government is going to give them up.
Let me go back to the mission of Mr. Song Tao. Do you think his visit to Pyongyang was actually a result of the negotiation and summit between President Xi Jinping and his American counterpart during Trump's short stay in Beijing?
Well, it would be nice to think that that's true.
I raise this question in the context that North Korea remains a prioritized issue on the agenda of the State Department of the U.S. government, right?
Certainly, it does. It's also on the agenda of the U.S. Congress, which is extremely concerned that President Trump may lead the North Korean government to believe that a military attack is coming. When you use language like the time for dialogue is over, what comes after dialogue that's over? And there's a grave concern about miscalculation and misunderstanding. So any channel of communication, regardless of what is said, is definitely a positive step. And it would be nice to think that President Trump and President Xi were working together behind the scenes to send the envoy to Pyongyang.
What we talk about today in the studio would come to no avail if we only gave our viewers the simple feeling that whatever we do, however we get it done, is going to be a futile attempt. No deliverables except for the use of force. Do you think the war clouds are gathering?
I hope not. And I have just come from Tokyo, and we have a lot of relationships with colleagues in Japan and South Korea. And the consensus in both countries is that war is not an option, and that military options really aren't on the table. The United States practiced containment successfully for decades.
Wait a minute. When we look at the implications of military might and military maneuvers on the doorsteps of China, we have two kinds of shows. One is flexing military muscles as a kind of deterrence or coercive use of the military force to let DPRK know the formidable presence of the U.S. military in this region. The other is once the DPRK wants to go ahead with yet another nuclear test or missile test, and if it were to fly above Japan, like what happened previously,
twice,
if that missile was to be intercepted, then Mr. Kim Jong-un would be infuriated. And then what do you think of the strong possibility that a preemptive strike might happen as a result of his anger?
You mean a preemptive first attack from North Korea?
Yeah.
I think the chances of that are extremely small.
But then the accidental intercepting of a missile from the DPRK might lead to dramatic escalation of the tensions. That's what I mean.
Well, if the intercept happened, it wouldn't be accidental. It would be difficult for Japan to do that. Not impossible with the technology that's available to both the United States and Japan.
The THAAD might do the job, right?
It would more likely be the Aegis
I see.
System that would be the most appropriate choice for intercepting a missile at that altitude.
Then what about the maneuver by 3 aircraft carrier strike groups simultaneously? Many would say anything less than 3 would just be used as a deterrent, but 3 aircraft carriers at the same time, if you put that into the context of what President Trump said a few weeks ago, strategic patience is over. And you had somehow alluded to that before. What do you think of the implications of this unprecedented military maneuver?
I think President Trump is trying to find some way to make it look like he's being stronger than his predecessors. But there's no consensus within the U.S. defense community about a plan to preemptively take out North Korean missile or nuclear weapons facilities. Most people feel that that's just not an option. So if you add one more aircraft carrier or you do a few more overflights, you're strengthening your message, I suppose, but you're not really changing the status quo. And you're certainly not leading North Korea to believe that it should talk to the United States about its security situation.
Thank you so much. Let me go to Mr. Pavel Fagonhor in Russia. Hello, Pavel. Isn't this ridiculous?
Well, yes.
Isn't this ridiculous and counterproductive to, on the one hand, try to persuade President Xi Jinping to leverage our limited resources in hopefully bringing the DPRK back to the negotiating table through diplomacy? On the other hand, 3 aircraft carrier strike groups are concentrating in this turbulent water of the Korean peninsula. I mean, this is just ridiculous. What China does would just be it would be counterproductive. So what do you think of the contradiction, the ridiculous move by the White House?
Well, apparently from looking from Washington and from President Trump and his military advisors, who the 3 good generals, General Kelly, General McMaster, and General Mattis, who are very much involved in formulating this policy, that is all part of the package to increase tension and to increase pressure on North Korea till they understand that they have to give in. But of course it's very possible that they won't give in and that they will increase tension from their own side. And that may lead actually to, of course, hostilities. Again, I don't believe at all that there's going to be a so-called preemptive strike coming from the United States. But the United States, to begin military action, needs a very good pretext to do that. And the North Koreans may provide that by sending some kind of missile, say, with a nuclear warhead to explode somewhere over the Pacific, which could be treated as a casus belli. In Beijing and Moscow, when people are trying to kind of de-escalate this situation, there's a belief that basically the world should kind of accept de facto North Korean nuclear capabilities and missile capabilities and build something like during the Cold War, some kind of peaceful coexistence situation.
You know,
that's
Pavel, excuse me, Pavel,
totally
you know,
what
Mr.
the
Sun Tao, the
Americans are
special
doing.
envoy of President Xi Jinping,
Yes.
just came back from Pyongyang. Of course, he went there to undertake some mission, trying or seeking to persuade Mr. Kim Jong-un to accept the international efforts. However, at the same time, the Trump administration listed the DPRK as a sponsor of terrorism. Don't you think this policy move by the White House has made China look very stupid?
Well, right now for the Americans, that is not really the main problem. The main problem is to deal somehow with the North Korean nuclear issue. I don't believe that at present the American administration is ready to accept North Korea de facto even as a nuclear power. And so the pressure is going to increase. America is going to turn to Russia and to China to increase pressure, and will increase pressure on its own, and put more and more sanctions, putting North Korea into an intolerable situation where they may have a slip of judgment and will provide casus belli.
Well, I'm afraid,
Pavel,
when we come back after the short break, we'll go to the issue of nuclear capability of the Persian state of Iran. But having said this, let me come back to ask my American guest speaker here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Kalaki, what will be the consequences arising from listing the DPRK as a sponsor of terrorism?
I think the most significant consequences is going to make it very hard for other countries to maintain any sort of contact, informal or formal business contacts that the North Koreans can use. And so they're going to be more concerned, and I guess that's a good thing in the sense that it'll further restrict North Korea's freedom of action in the international community, although you really can't restrict it much more than it's already restricted, given the severity of the latest round of UN sanctions. So I don't think it's going to have an effect on North Korea, but I think it will, somewhat tighten the noose just a little bit more. I don't think it's going to change their behavior, though.
Thank you, Gregory. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Gregory Kulaki, Senior Analyst and China Project Manager of the Union of the Concerned Scientists, an NGO, and Mr. Pavel Fagohar, a Russian military analyst. We are talking about whether war will break out anytime soon in the near future, and what does it mean to list the DPRK as a sponsor of terrorism. After we come back, we'll try to associate the case of the DPRK denuclearization process with a similar one of Iran. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, Pavel and Gregory. Let me raise one follow-up question before we go to Iran. Gregory, it's reported that the ROK, or South Korea, has been the decisive factor in preventing the United States from turning to the use of force, given the huge civilian casualties in day one of such a military strike, if it's to be a nuclear strike. Other than this, what do you think should be the other factors that prevent generals of the Pentagon from making the decision? Because you said and suggested somehow in the first part of the program that the military option has basically been ruled out, although all options are, in theory, put on the table.
There's only one general among the three, and that's Mr. McMaster, who is talking about preemptive options.
Some politicians need to play good guy and bad guy. That's a show, right?
No, because these are private discussions with legislators on Capitol Hill about what U.S. options are. And I think there's a difference between Mr. Mattis and Mr. McMaster over the viability of some sort of preemptive attempt to take out North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities. I just don't think people in the United States would support taking that risk. And more than that, certainly our allies, both in Japan and in South Korea, don't support taking that kind of a risk, because they're the ones that are going to pay the price.
What do you think of the latest rapprochement between ROK and the PRC, despite the deployment of the THAAD, the Missile Shield program?
I think it's a positive development. I wish there was more of a rapprochement between all three of the major nations in East Asia. I think that, more than anything else, might convince North Korea that discussions could be more productive than they seem to North Korea at the moment.
Does it mean there's a possibility that Seoul of ROK might go back to something similar to the Sunshine Policy, to rebuild the industrial park and to resume the policy of family reunions, so that some kind of groundwork would be laid for defusing the current tensions across the 38th parallel? Should that be one of the policy options of Moon Jae-in, the newly elected leader of ROK? Will that go against the latest move by the White House to list the DPRK as a sponsor of the terrorism? Because if you want to go back to the policy of rapprochement, that will definitely go against this very draconian policy of calling DPRK just a rogue state, axis of evil, whatever you name it. That's the legacy of the Bush administration.
I think Moon has said that he'd like to move in that direction, but it's just not the time to do that. North Korea's going to have to do something to reduce tensions before he's going to have the political space in South Korea, much less the political space with the United States to pursue those kinds of policies. I think what he's trying to communicate to the United States is, if you're our ally and you're our protector, you need to ask us first before you do anything militarily on the Korean Peninsula. And I think that message has gotten through.
Right, that's a loud and clear message. Well, let me go back to Pavel. Pavel, the next question is very much about Iran. Iran obviously disagrees with Washington, where Trump threatened to terminate the 6+1, the outcome of the 6+1 negotiation. And the spiritual leader, Khamenei, was very angry, of course. Plus, the latest move by Riyadh to kind of have a very serious relationship with
Hezbollah, which is backed up by Tehran. Now, what do you think of the case of nuclear the case of denuclearization in Tehran? Can we draw a sort of comparison between Iran and the DPRK?
Well, both Iran and North Korea have been in very close cooperation on nuclear development and on missile development. Basically, Iran's missiles, most of them, are derivatives of what was made in North Korea. The technologies has been passed, nuclear technologies and missile technologies. And if right now, apparently, the Iranian nuclear program is on hold, the missile program is developing, and Iran believes it has the right for that. And it's also clear that North Korea will transfer its newly acquired capabilities, the capability to build and produce something like the old Russian R-250 powerful missile engine, and make long-range missiles. So that's the main problem. That's what connects North Korea and Iran, that there will be transfers. And that's why North Korea having a nuclear and missile potential in the future means that Iran will also have it.
Pavel, except for bluffs, the military maneuvers, and other coercive means and approaches by the Pentagon, it seems what happens in Northeast Asia would just be a war game. It's just exchange of accusations. So do you think that will set a very bad example for Iran to go ahead with its own nuclear capability? And what does that mean for Israel, which is known for having its own nuclear deterrence? And this the core issue here, I'm afraid, is the nuclear proliferation.
Yes, that's the main problem is nuclear and missile proliferation. But tensions are growing not only because of that. It's just been reported that the Americans apparently declared some of the pro-Iranian Shia militias in Iraq as terrorist organizations. And in exchange, those militias announced that they may target American troops that are deployed in Iraq. Most of them are deployed in the North Kurdish Autonomous Region. So there can be Iranian-American direct clashes, or through some proxy in Iraq, and then maybe in Syria too. So the tension is growing not only in the Gulf, the entire region is growing. And this is very dangerous because it may lead to the eventual collapse of the action plan that froze the Iranian nuclear program but didn't freeze the missile program. And it could be sliding to war not only in the Far East but also in the Middle East. I mean, a big one.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for being with us. Towards the end of this meaningful dialogue, Gregory, what do you think of the possibility that Iran's growing defiance has actually been encouraged by the bluff and the bluff only from Pentagon in Northeast Asia, because no military actions would be taking place and no war would break out, and therefore the Persian state of Iran would definitely go ahead with its own nuclear capability. And don't forget, Iran has forged a kind of access with Turkey, Russia, of course Hezbollah is a part of it, Hamas is a minor player. Now this geopolitical reconfiguration may have encouraged Tehran to develop its own nuclear program, and the United States would do nothing.
I think the situation in Iran and the situation in North Korea are very different. Iran's in a much stronger position. It doesn't need nuclear weapons the same way that North Korea needs nuclear weapons to feel safe, to feel like it can deter the United States.
That's very interesting.
And I think the goal of the Iranian program has basically been achieved.
You have underestimated the impact of the Israeli nuclear arsenal. Now, these two countries, Iran and Israel, are said to be arch rivals. They have been on loggerheads. If one side, which is very hostile to Tehran, does possess nuclear arsenal, then what about the natural response from the other side?
Well, Israel's had nuclear weapons for a long time. And there have been periods in modern history and post-war history when the Israelis and the Iranians got along quite well. So I don't think that that particular tension is the driver of the Iranian efforts to have a capability to become a nuclear weapon state if at some point in the future they feel it's necessary. And they've maintained enough of a capability to be able to make that step if they want to, but I don't think that they're feeling any particular pressure, the same way that North Korea is feeling tremendous pressure to take that step now. So I think the agreement, regardless of what happens in North Korea, I think the agreement will hold.
Well, thank you for coming to join our discussion about the issue of nuclear proliferation and the immediate prospects of the DPRK in terms of the military maneuvers by the Pentagon on our doorsteps. We have a lot to discuss next time. Thank you so much, Gregory.
It was my pleasure.
With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.